Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This is Paramita, and once again I heartily welcome you back to my channel Paramita PM. If you are new to my channel, then I would request you to go through the content of my channel, look at the videos, and if you really find the content of my channel helpful, then do like it, share it, and please do not forget to subscribe to my channel. And now, without any further delay, let's get into the lecture. In this lecture, I am going to look at the poem Goblin Market by the famous Victorian poet Christina Rossetti. Goblin Market was published in 1859, and it became, initially, though the poem was received as a parable, or you can say it was received as a moral allegory, but because of the content of the poem, it actually opened, or gave rise to different types of different kinds of interpretations with regard to the content. Now, in order to understand Goblin Market and the relevance of its content, it is very important to know the historical context of this poem. Goblin Market was, like I said, it was written in 1859. So it belonged to we can say that it is a representative work of the Victorian period. Now let me talk about the historical context in Goblin Market. The first thing that we should note here is that Victorian era. Victorian era was a very conservative period. It had, strict rules and expectations about sexuality. It had strict rules for both genders, both men and women. As far as women are concerned, women were seen as weak, fragile, innocent, and someone who shouldn't have any sexual appetite, and they should never express, even if they have any sexual desire, they should never give expression to their sexual desires and not make any attempt to fulfill them. As far as men are concerned, in contrast, men were seen as taking advantage of the fragility of women. But then later on, all these rules and expectations of the Victorian era changed, whereby we find that women were then seen at fault. They were considered that it was considered that women were at fault for enticing men, for seducing men who simply acted on their inherent, or you can say innate, sexual desires. But one thing that remained consistent throughout Victorian era was the idea of chastity. Chastity remained important, or it was considered, it was valued much in the Victorian era. Here in the context of this poem, I would like to focus more on the plight of women, or on the condition of women during the Victorian era. Like I said, there were strict rules and expectations about sexuality. Like for women, talking about sexuality was seen as a taboo. And as far as a woman's chastity or purity is concerned, it was the most important thing in the Victorian era. So if a woman was not pure, if she was not chaste, or if ever she committed anything which went against the accepted norm of the society or the code of conduct that was laid down for women to follow, she was looked down upon in society. So this is something that we should keep in mind while reading the text Goblin Market, while analyzing the content of the poem. Then let me talk about the inspiration as to what led Christina Rossetti write a poem like Goblin Market, which became later on, which became a seminal text, and where we find several critics, like feminist critics, or you can say Freudian critics. Everyone became very much interested in this particular text, and they came up with their own valuable interpretations. The first inspiration could be that during this time, when this poem was written, Christina Rossetti volunteered. She volunteered herself to work for an institution which was actually let's say not kind of which was actually a rehabilitation center for the fallen women. So she volunteered to work for St. Mary Magdalene's penitentiary. It was a rehabilitation center for the fallen women, because this very institution believed that even if a woman loses her chastity, her purity, but she can be redeemed. So therefore we find Christina Rossetti devoting herself and working with these women who transgressed sexually, or who actually engaged or involved themselves in deviant sexual acts. Another inspiration comes from the way this poem is dedicated. This poem is dedicated to MFR, which are the initials for Christina's sister Mary, who it is reportedly said that Mary actually helped Christina avoid eloping with a married man. So these are the two let's say two proposed ideas for the inspiration behind the text. So in order to, like I said, in order to understand the content, or in order to understand the poem Goblin Market, the historical background is very, very important. The first thing, the two inspirations, especially the first one where we find Christina Rossetti volunteering herself for working at the rehabilitation center, and secondly the Victorian code of conduct, where and the kind of expectations that Victorian society had from both genders, both men and women. The poem Goblin Market has a fairy tale like setting, and then we find that it also explores themes like temptation, sacrifice, and salvation or redemption. As the poem opens, we find that it tells the story of two sisters, Laura and Lizzie, and as we read the poem, we find these two sisters encountering goblin merchants. Now, who these goblin merchants are? These goblin merchants are depicted as those people who are selling different kinds of fruits, and they describe their fruit in a very voluptuous manner, and in order to tempt, or in order to seduce Laura. Now, as far as Laura is concerned, Laura is someone who becomes, who gives in to this temptation, and she exchanges a lock of hair in order to have a fruit from the goblin merchants, because she didn't have any money with her. And after that we find that she has the fruit, she eats the fruit, though initially she is seen in a state of ecstasy, but gradually her health deteriorates, and it deteriorates to such an extent that she becomes very pale, and she also develops that her golden hair, it turns into gray hair, it gets transformed, and gradually her health deteriorates, and she appears to wither away completely. And when Lizzie finds that her sister's health is deteriorating with every passing day, she couldn't bear it. And although since the very beginning of the poem we find that Lizzie is someone who looked upon these goblin men as dangerous, though she also felt let's say she also felt attracted towards them, but she could restrain herself, restrain herself from giving in to such temptation, unlike Laura. So as a result of this, we find that Laura, she gets seduced by the goblin men, and she gives in to the temptation, and as a result she also suffers the negative consequences of having eaten the fruit. Now, the fruit that is eaten by Laura can be compared to the forbidden fruit that was eaten by Adam and Eve, and therefore they also they also suffered the consequences after having eaten that forbidden fruit, despite being warned by god. So here also in this poem, from that perspective, we can compare Laura to Eve and her action as well. As far as Lizzie is concerned, we find that when Lizzie fails to perceive this condition of her sister Laura, when she couldn't any longer, bear it, she decides to she prepares herself to encounter the goblin men, and she goes. But Lizzie, like I said, compared to Laura, if we draw a comparison between the two sisters, we shall find that Lizzie is more cautious, and Lizzie is more aware of the dangers, associated with this goblin men. Therefore, when she prepares herself to go and visit the goblin men, we find that she carries money with her so that she doesn't have to exchange, anything with them in order to have the fruit. So as she goes and encounters the goblin men, we find that they welcome her wholeheartedly, like they appear to be very friendly towards Lizzie in the very beginning. But she continues to tell them that this is the money that I have, and now I want you to give me the fruit. But the goblin men insist her to eat the fruit in their company, to have the fruit, and they also tell her that if she carries the fruit away from the glen, then she might fail to taste the actual flavor of the fruit, thereby indicating that if this fruit is carried away from the glen where they are selling, then the fruit will lose its flavor. But still we find Lizzie so resolute, so determined, that she sticks to her point and she simply refuses to eat the fruit, which causes the goblin men, become, or which makes the goblin men very, very angry, and then they begin to criticize her, calling her very proud and also calling her as uncivil. And later on we find that as they get frustrated and they find it very difficult, to seduce Lizzie to give in to their temptation, where they actually went wrong, because just as they have been successful in luring Laura, they felt that they could do the same with Lizzie as well. But here the goblin men went completely wrong. They mistook Lizzie, and they mistook Lizzie, thinking that they could very easily, seduce her. So when they failed in their attempt, to seduce Lizzie, what they did, they simply, forced the fruit into her mouth, and she, all her face, and she was completely, smeared, drenched in fruit juices. And this could be very well, this could be read as a sexual, or interpreted as a sexual assault on Lizzie, because she was brutally attacked. She was they clawed her with their nails, they kicked her, they jostled her, they knocked her down. So metaphorically, this could represent a sexual assault, rape on Lizzie. But despite the brutal attack, we find that Lizzie does not get seduced, Lizzie does not give in, and therefore she comes out victorious, thereby defeating these goblin men, because out of their frustration they get tired in facing Lizzie's determination to not eat the fruit. The goblin men finally, they get very, very tired, and they give in, and finally they disappear. And Lizzie then carries the fruit, because now she's all drenched, her face, her neck, everything is drenched in fruit juices. So now she's in hurry. She hurriedly goes back to her home and allows her sister Laura to simply, kiss the juices from her sister's face. And then finally we find that she is restored back to her previous form, that Laura's state of health is restored. And it's not just her state of health, but here we can say that her joy, her peace, and her jovial state of mind, everything is restored back. So the fruit that seemingly appeared to be very delicious in the beginning actually had a very poisonous effect on Laura, which caused her health to deteriorate. But later on, the same fruit juice acts or serves as a restorative medicine for Laura. And here we find that Lizzie sacrifices herself, in the sense that she encountered the goblin men despite being aware of the dangers associated with them, despite being afraid of them in the very in the beginning. She encountered them, she braved them, and she fought against them very bravely. And here she represents, a Christ-like figure in sacrificing herself to save her sister Laura. And therefore, like I said, Laura could be compared to the first Eve. So here, in this context, Lizzie could be compared to the second Eve. Why? Because the second Eve here is Mary, and this is a biblical allusion that can be very well related to Lizzie's sacrifice, where we find Lizzie undergoing suffering and undergoing this brutal attack from the goblin men in order to save her sister Laura. And as the poem ends, we find that these two young girls, Laura and Lizzie, they are now seen as adult women who have their children and who are living a happy life. So with this, the poem concludes. Now, on the surface, the poem appears to be very simple. It appears to be a poem that is meant for children, but if we delve deeply into the content and if we try to figure out the embedded significance, then we shall find that this poem has several layers of interpretations. Like I said, the poem Goblin Market has different interpretations, but though initially it was received as a moral allegory about the dangers of giving into temptations, but later on this poem was restructured, or not restructured actually, you can say it was reinterpreted by the feminists. Now there are different aspects in the poem that can be very much related to different interpretations. For instance, the first point or the first interpretation is that this poem can be read as a warning about the dangers of a free market economy. By a free market economy, what I mean is that when things are sold in a market where government does not intervene, and therefore we come across products that are much compromised in their quality, then it could be also read as a protest. It could be read as a protest against the malpractices that were very much prevalent in the Victorian society in relation to food adulteration. Now, during the Victorian era, this food adulteration or food contamination was at its height. Now, by this food contamination, what I mean is that during this time period, much of the food that was consumed by the working class was found to be befouled, was found to be completely, contaminated, and this food had, traces of human excreta, in such a way their food was contaminated. Then there is another example where we find that the London county, observed a few samples of the medical officer, the London County medical officer. He actually observed a few samples of ice cream, and he found that those samples of ice cream had bed bugs, fleas, even hair of cat and dog. So it is quite natural that after the consumption of such an ice cream, people would suffer from diseases like diarrhea, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and so on. Even the meat that was sold by the butchers during the Victorian time, the meat mainly came from those animals with who were already diseased or suffered from pleuro or pneumonia, or had already died because of being attacked by pleuro pneumonia. So such was the situation. So like I said, this food adulteration and contamination was at its height in the Victorian period. Now, if we take into account the poem, we shall find that we can very much relate the plight of Laura to these interpretations. Now, how? How can we relate Laura's plight to these interpretations? After having eaten the fruit, Laura suffers from ill health. With every passing day, her health deteriorates and she is found to be almost on the verge of death. So we can see that maybe we can, like this very instance, the goblin men could represent, those merchants, who involved in this free market economy and therefore sold, contaminated food products, which led to the breakdown of health of the common man. So Laura could represent a victim of such an instance in this poem. Another interpretation, before I move on to another interpretation, so we can say that this poem therefore can be read as a warning, or we can read it as a protest against these hazardous practices in the Victorian, that were very much prevalent in the Victorian era. Another interpretation could be like giving into temptation, okay, and giving into the theme of salvation and sacrifice that we come across in the poem. So this could be read as a Christian tale of sacrifice and salvation. Now let us consider the plight of the fallen women. Since Christina Rossetti worked for these fallen women, she worked with them as an associate sister at St. Mary Magdalene's Penitentiary. So, she was highly influenced by her experience, and therefore this is very much evident in the text itself, where we find that just as this rehabilitation center deemed those fallen women to be redeemable, they felt that yes, they could be saved. Similarly, in the poem, we find that even after having eaten the forbidden fruit, Laura is saved, and not just saved, but both Laura and Lizzie, we find them, living as an adult, living their marital life happily with their children. Although in the 19th century, literature and works of art, fallen women were usually depicted as someone who was beyond redemption, who could never be redeemed. It is here where Christina Rossetti simply departs from this prevalent message in the Victorian era, which looked down upon the fallen women and therefore banished them from their society, or sometimes they also sent them to colonies. But in the poem, we find that Laura and Lizzie, they get married, they have children. So two states, motherhood and marriage, which were considered to be an ideal state for a woman, are achieved by Laura and Lizzie, despite being seen as fallen women in the poem. So from here we can understand Christina Rossetti's perspective, that she is completely, she doesn't agree with the prevalent or with the dominant view of the time, that once a woman, transgresses sexually, that she can never be redeemed. And after this, we can see that this poem can be also read as an expression of, let's say, incestuous yearning, because the kind of, there is an underlying, there is a sexual innuendo of a sexual relationship in the poem, because we find in the poem that Laura and Lizzie, they sleep with each other with their arms, in each other's arms. So this could have an innuendo of sexual relationship, where we find these two sisters, yearning for an incestuous relationship. So like I said, this poem has, different interpretations and different critics, because of their immense interest in this work of in this literary work. They came up with their valuable interpretations. Hence, to conclude, it can be said that in the poem Goblin Market, Christina Rossetti actually offers a solution, or we can say that she advocates a solution for the fallen women, and wherein the poet puts much emphasis or gives much importance to female solidarity and care, where she believes that this unity, or this sisterly care can actually help redeem a fallen woman by the unfallen woman, which is very much seen in the poem, where we find Laura is saved by Lizzie. Now, Laura having eaten the forbidden fruit, so it means that she gave in to the temptation of sexual desire, where she couldn't, restrain herself. But as far as Lizzie is concerned, she is also brutally attacked, physically attacked by the goblin men. But despite the experiences encountered by both the sisters, we find that ultimately in the poem they are blessed with a peaceful, happy life by the poet. And herein lies the significance of the poem, where we find Christina Rossetti completely departing from the conventional representation of the fallen women that was prevalent in the Victorian era, that could be very well seen in the 19th century literature and other forms of art as well. So with this, I come to the end of this lecture. I hope you find this lecture helpful. So if you really like it and feel that my explanation has helped you in understanding the poem, then do like it, share it, and please do not forget to subscribe to my channel. Until then, bye bye.